baby astronauts. And babies run the world.
Sorry, Pops. It's not your mission.
Loss of bowel control. Should be fine.
No problems. Okay, now, this is fun. Far enough. Another free. A real one. Now. Go, 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 go. Wake up tomorrow. Deal?
I'm gonna go where navigation says.
Turn left.
Thank you, navigation.
Turn right.
Sorry.
Turn left. Proceed on the current route.
They can always trust. Holy!
Tim!
Welcome back to the Cine Flux. If you are here, I already know something about you. You are the kind of person who does not just sit in front of a film. You sit with it. You let it settle into you. You carry it home. And today I want to sit with you and talk about a film that arrived wearing the costume of a children's animated sequel and quietly, almost mischievously, said something true about what it means to grow older, to drift from the people you love most, and to choose, not by accident, but deliberately, to find your way back to them. So pull up something warm, get comfortable, and let us enter this together. This is the Cine Flux. And this is the boss baby, family business. There is an image I keep returning to. Not from the climax, not from any of the film's busiest, most dazzling sequences. It is a quieter thing than that. It is the image of two grown men, brothers, standing across from each other as children again, not as a special effect, not as a plot device, but as a moment of grace. And what the film asks you to feel in that moment is not nostalgia exactly, though nostalgia is part of it. What it asks you to feel is the specific ache of knowing that somewhere between then and now, something real and irreplaceable was quietly set down, and neither of you noticed until it was already behind you. That is the soul of this film, right there. Before a single joke lands, before a single action sequence dazzles. That is what this film is made of. The question it keeps asking underneath everything else is this: when did you stop being brothers, and do you even remember the exact moment it happened? The Boss Baby, Family Business was released in 2021. It was directed by Tom McGrath, who also helmed the original 2017 film. It was produced by DreamWorks Animation and distributed by Universal Pictures. The film stars the voices of Alec Baldwin, James Marsden, Amy Sedaris, Eva Longoria, Ariana Greenblatt, and the extraordinary Jeff Goldblum, who brings a peculiar and deeply specific kind of menace to his villain that we will spend time with later. It is the sequel to The Boss Baby, which was itself a wildly successful and genuinely surprising film. A film that used the concept of a briefcase carrying infant executive as a lens through which to examine sibling rivalry, parental attention, and the very real fear a child feels when the world they have always known is suddenly rearranged by someone new. The sequel inherits all of that emotional territory and expands it, moving the story forward in time, introducing new characters, and deepening the themes rather than simply replaying them. This is at its heart a film about what happens after childhood ends, about what brotherhood looks like when life has put you in different directions and the distance between you has become comfortable enough that you have stopped noticing it. It is a film for children on its surface. It is absolutely unmistakably a film for adults underneath. When I first sat with this film, I expected a sequel doing what sequels so often do, returning to a successful formula, pressing the same emotional buttons in the same sequence, banking on the goodwill of the original, rather than earning anything new. I want to be honest about that expectation because it matters to what came next. I came in with my guard partially up. The first film had moved me in ways I had not entirely anticipated, and I was protective of that experience. I did not want a carbon copy. What happened instead, and this is the part I keep coming back to, is that the fin opened with a kind of gentleness that immediately disarmed me. The first images are of time passing, not dramatically, not with swelling music or a montage of highlight moments, just quietly, just the way time actually passes, which is to say, without your permission and without enough ceremony. We are shown the Templeton brothers cemented as men now, grown men with grown lives, wives and mortgages and routines. And already before a single plot mechanism has been introduced, there is something slightly sad in the air. Not tragic. Sad the way a Sunday evening can be sad. The way a photograph of someone you used to talk to every day can make you catch your breath for just a moment. I felt that in the opening minutes, and it told me that this film was going to be more serious about its emotional intentions than I had assumed. What follows is a story that moves on two levels simultaneously, and the dual track architecture is, I think, the film's most impressive structural achievement. On the surface level, you have everything you expect and want from this kind of animated adventure: a mission, a villain, a ticking clock, a world of secret baby espionage that is rendered with extraordinary visual invention and color and energy. There is genuine comedy here, and it earns its laughs not through laziness, but through timing and character specificity, which is the only kind of comedy that holds up. Tim and Ted are temporarily de-aged back to childhood by a magical baby formula. A plot device that is, yes, completely absurd, and the film knows it, and it leans into that absurdity with cheerful confidence rather than trying to justify it. But beneath that adventure, beneath the jokes and the chases and the spectacle, there is a story about two brothers who have let their relationship slowly calcify into something they maintain out of obligation more than warmth. And they show up for each other on the calendar, but they are not truly present for each other in the way they once were, in the way that only children can be present for each other, completely, carelessly, without the protective armor that adulthood builds around the softest parts of you. The film lets both stories run in parallel, and it never sacrifices one for the other. And here is where the film shifts completely, because the choice to return the brothers to childhood is not just a plot convenience, it is the film's thesis made physical. It is the film saying the only way to remember who you were to each other is to actually go back there, not metaphorically, not in a conversation. Back there, in your body, in your voice, in the world as it looked and felt, when love between siblings was still instinctive rather than effortful. That is a bold thing to put into an animated film aimed at families on a Saturday afternoon, and the film pulls it off. And so now we arrive at what the film actually achieves, not as a checklist of successful elements, but as a living thing, a constructed experience. And I want to take real time here, because this is where the film earns its depth and where the craft becomes inseparable from the feeling. Let us begin with performance, because performance is where animated cinema is most underestimated and where this film, I would argue, is most quietly extraordinary. Alec Baldwin returns as the voice of Ted Templeton, the boss baby himself, now a successful hedge fund manager who has traded in his baby suit for an adult one, but who has not, we sense, ever truly stopped being the person who needed to win every room he entered. Baldwin has always had a specific kind of vocal authority that carries both comedy and melancholy in the same breath. His voice is large and it is sharp, and it carries with it a long history of playing men who project confidence as a survival mechanism, men who have built their entire identities around competence and control because vulnerability once cost them something they were not prepared to lose. What he brings to Ted in this sequel is something more nuanced than what the first film asked of him. In the original, Ted was primarily a comic creation. The absurdity of a baby in a suit with an agenda was the joke, and Baldwin played that joke with total commitment. Here, he is asked to play a man who has forgotten something, a man who has built a life that is impressive on every observable metric and yet somehow incomplete in a way he cannot fully articulate because the language for what is missing requires a closeness he has stopped practicing. Baldwin does all of this without ever stepping outside the comedy. That is the extraordinary part. He is funny and he is sad at the same time, and he makes it look effortless, which means the craft is invisible, which means it is working exactly as it should. James Marsden, taking over the role of adult Tim Templeton from Tobey Maguire, brings something warm and slightly unguarded to the character that serves the film's emotional needs perfectly. Tim is the more emotionally present of the two brothers. He is the one who feels the distance more acutely, who senses that something between them has shifted and has not been addressed, who carries a low-level grief about it that he has learned to fold into the ordinary business of daily life. Marston has always been an actor who can make openness look heroic rather than naive, and that quality is precisely what Tim requires. There is a moment, and we will return to it in more detail when we enter spoiler territory, where Tim, back in the body of his childhood self, has to make a choice that costs him something real, and Marston delivers the emotional weight of that moment with nothing more than his voice, with nothing more than a few syllables and a breath, and it works completely. It works because Marsden has been building toward it from the first scene, quietly, steadily, without drawing attention to the construction. The newcomers to the cast deserve extended attention because they are in many ways the film's secret weapons. Ariana Greenblatt voices Tabitha, Tim's eldest daughter, who is in many ways the emotional engine of the second half of the film. Tabitha is a child who is exceptional. Not exceptional the way gifted children are described in press releases, but exceptional in the specific and lonely way that real children who are vastly more competent than their peers actually experience it. She is ahead of everyone around her, and the gap between her gifts and her need for connection is a source of quiet pain she has not yet found the language to name. Greenblatt plays her with a maturity and a restraint that is genuinely impressive, and she makes Tabitha's loneliness feel earned rather than assigned. The film does something rare with this character. It refuses to resolve her exceptionalism, refuses to make it the problem to be fixed, and instead sits with it as a complicated truth. What Tabitha needs is not to be less gifted, what she needs is to be known, and the film understands that distinction clearly. Jeff Goldblum as Doctor Erwin Armstrong is a different kind of achievement altogether. Goldblum does not play villains often, and when he does, there is always the question of how much of the performance will be Goldblum being himself versus Goldblum being someone genuinely threatening. Here the answer is that the film has found a way to make Goldblum being himself the source of the threat, and it is a brilliant piece of casting logic. Armstrong is a man who believes, with total sincerity, with no detectable self-awareness, that children should be perpetually childlike, that adulthood is a kind of failure, that the loss of innocence is not a necessary passage, but a tragedy that can and should be engineered away. The horror of that belief is that it comes from somewhere recognizable. It is not cartoonish evil, It is the evil of nostalgia weaponized, of love curled into control, of someone who was once hurt by growing up and has decided the correct response to that hurt is to prevent it from happening to anyone else, regardless of whether anyone asks. Goldblum delivers all of this with his characteristic rhythm, the pauses that stretch just long enough to become uncanny, the sudden warmth that makes the coldness immediately following it feel more disturbing by contrast, the sense of a mind that is always running several calculations ahead of the conversation while somehow also being entirely in the moment. It is a performance that rewards attention. The writing in this film, and I want to sit with this for a genuine length of time because it tends to be overlooked in animated sequels, is smarter than its genre classification suggests it needs to be, and that intelligence is most visible not in the big comedic set pieces but in the small, seemingly throwaway moments that do the film's heaviest lifting. The screenplay was written by Michael McCullers, who also wrote the first film, and there is a consistency of voice across both scripts that speaks to a writer who is genuinely invested in these characters rather than simply servicing the demands of a franchise. What McCullers does particularly well is write siblings. He understands that the language of brotherhood is not the language of friendship. It is more compressed, more referential, more loaded with historical context that is never fully explained because it does not need to be, because both parties already know the history. There are lines in this film that hit with the precision of a memory, lines that feel specific rather than general, lived rather than constructed. When Tim and Ted return to their childhood bodies, fall back into old rhythms of bickering and teasing, and then suddenly, without transition, into genuine collaboration and warmth, it feels true not because it is explained, but because it is explained, but because it is simply shown. That is the mark of a screenplay that trusts its material and trusts its audience. There is a particular scene, again, we will unpack it fully in the spoiler section, where Tim says something to Ted that is framed as a joke, but is actually the most honest thing either of them has said to the other in the entire film. And the film lets it live as both things simultaneously. It does not underline it. It does not have another character reflected back to validate it. It just lets it exist in the air between them and move on, the way real revelations often happen in real relationships, quickly, almost accidentally, and then covered over again by ordinary conversation before either person has fully processed what just occurred. That is the kind of writing that elevates a film from functional to genuinely felt, and it happens here more than once. The visual language of this film is something I find myself wanting to describe carefully because it is easy to look at DreamWorks animation of this era and see technically accomplished execution without seeing the artistic intention behind every choice. Tom McGrath and his visual team are doing something deliberate with color and space in this film that deserves to be named. The world of Tabitha School, the Acorn Center, the institution at the center of the film's plot, is rendered in a palette that is just slightly too bright, just slightly too controlled, just slightly too perfectly arranged. There is something subtly wrong about it, and that wrongness is communicated visually before a single line of dialogue confirms it. The brightness is aggressive rather than warm. The order is rigid rather than peaceful. Color in this film is not decoration, it is information. It tells you what kind of space you are in and what that space is doing to the people inside it before you have been told anything explicitly. Contrast that with the sequences that take place in the emotional interior of the brothers' shared childhood, the spaces the film imagines when Tim and Ted are brought back to their younger selves. Here the palette shifts. It becomes warmer, softer, slightly less defined at the edges, as if memory itself has a different visual texture than the present tense. These are not flashbacks exactly. They are something more like felt spaces, spaces that are colored by emotional truth rather than photographic accuracy. The film uses this visual distinction between intelligence, and it means that even before you have registered it consciously, your body knows the difference between the world of the present and the world of remembered love. That is cinema using its most fundamental tools, light and color and space, to carry meaning that words alone cannot deliver. Think about what that means in a film aimed at children. Think about how much the film is trusting its youngest audience to feel something it is not explaining, to receive information through sensation rather than statement. That is a kind of respect that animated cinema at its best always extends to its audience, and that lesser animated films always underestimate. The score for this film was composed by Hans Zimmer and Steve Mazzaro, and I want to be precise about what it does and does not do, because the relationship between the music and the film's emotional life is more sophisticated than it might appear on first listen. Zimmer is a composer whose work is so ubiquitous in contemporary cinema that it has become easy to take for granted, to hear the music and not register what it is choosing to do in any specific moment. Here, what strikes me most is restraint. For a film that is visually and comedically very busy, the score is often surprisingly minimum. And the moments of minimalism are not accidents, they are choices. In the film's most emotionally serious moments, the music often steps back rather than forward. It gives the scenes room to breathe. It trusts that the voice performances and the animation are doing enough, and that adding orchestral weight would actually diminish rather than amplify what is happening on screen. This is a harder compositional choice than it sounds. The temptation in animated filmmaking, particularly in films designed for broad family audiences, is always to underscore every emotion, to make the music do the feeling for you so that no member of the audience can miss the instruction. Zimmer and Mazzaro resist that temptation repeatedly, and the film is more emotionally honest for it. There are moments, though, where the score swells, where the full orchestral language arrives, and these moments are carefully chosen. There are moments where the film has decided that the emotion being depicted is large enough to require musical confirmation, where the restraint of earlier scenes has created enough space for the arrival of fullness to feel earned rather than imposed. The moment where the brothers are finally truly present with each other, not just physically proximate, not just sharing a mission, but genuinely reconnected, genuinely known to each other, that is where the score opens up. And because it has been so measured until that point, when it arrives with accumulated weight. You feel it as a release, which is the only way earned music can feel. Music that arrives too early or too readily feels like pressure. Music that has been withheld and then finally permitted feels like relief. Sound design in this film also deserves its moment, and it almost never receives one. The soundscape of the baby world, the secret infrastructure of infant intelligence and espionage, is constructed with tremendous playfulness and detail. There are layers of audio information in the action sequences that reward headphone listening, that reveal small jokes and embedded character details that you can only catch on a second or third viewing. The film is generous with this kind of layered craftsmanship, the sense that the team who made it was still finding things to add and embed and hide, even when they were not strictly necessary, because they were enjoying the construction, because the joy of making the thing is visible in the texture of the thing. That kind of craft generosity is rare in franchise animation, where the imperative to deliver on schedule can strip away the small pleasures that make a film worth returning to. Now, and here I want to be genuinely honest, because a film essay that refuses to name what does not work is not an essay, it is a press release. Let us talk about where this film falls short, where its ambitions exceed its execution, or where the machinery of franchise filmmaking exerts its gravity in ways that cost the film something real. The most significant tension in family business is one that the film is aware of but does not fully resolve, and naming it requires a moment of care. The film has two distinct emotional registers, and it moves between them. On one side, there is the warm, humane, genuinely moving story of two brothers reconnecting through the experience of revisited childhood. On the other side, there is the kinetic, colorful, joke-dense adventure story of baby espionage and a school that may be harboring dangerous secrets. These two registers are not incompatible. The first film managed a similar balance with considerable skill, but in family business, the seams between them are occasionally visible in a way they were not in the original. There are sequences, particularly in the film's second act, where the adventure machinery takes over so completely that the emotional thread temporarily disappears, and when the film tries to return to the emotional territory, it has to work slightly harder to reestablish the mood it had carefully built. The tonal management is not broken, it is workable, but it is occasionally uneven in a way that a more ruthless editorial pass might have addressed. The film is slightly too long for its emotional pacing, and that extra length lives almost entirely in the middle, in the action sequences that are individually well constructed but collectively exhausting. There is also a character who deserves more. Tina, the new boss baby, voiced by Amy Sedaris with enormous charm and comic precision, is introduced as a full player in the story, someone with her own agenda and her own particular genius, and Sedaris brings genuine life to every moment she is given. But the film ultimately marginalizes her in the third act in a way that feels like a structural choice made for convenience rather than for narrative or character reasons. She becomes in the film's final movement largely reactive, a tool in the plot rather than an agent within it. And given how much energy the film has invested in establishing her as someone specific and capable and interesting, that diminishment feels like a missed opportunity. Not a wound, exactly, but something that leaves you wanting more of what the film itself promised you, and that particular kind of disappointment, the disappointment of unmet potential rather than of outright failure, is the most honest kind to name. The villain's ideology, which I found genuinely compelling as a concept, is not given quite enough space to develop into something that truly challenges the heroes on an intellectual level. Armstrong's belief system, his conviction that childhood should be preserved and protected from the corrupting influence of adulthood, is philosophically interesting enough that it could have been used to pressure Tim and Ted's own journey more directly, to make them genuinely grapple with the question of whether growing up always means giving something up that was worth keeping. The film gestures at this conversation but does not fully commit to it. Armstrong ends up being defeated more than he ends up being answered, and there is a difference between those two things. A villain who is defeated can be forgotten. A villain whose ideas are actually engaged with, argued with, left unresolved in some productive way, that is a villain who stays with you. Armstrong is memorable because of Goldblum's performance, not because the film has truly wrestled with what he believes. These are genuine critiques, and I hold them with genuine conviction. But I want to be clear about what they are and what they are not. They are texture level imperfections in a film that is doing something real. They are the cost of ambition, the places where reaching further than your grasp leads a visible gap. They do not undo what the film achieves. They simply represent the distance between a very good film and a great one. Now let us turn to the making of this film, because the production story of Family Business is, in several ways, as interesting as the film itself, and understanding how it was built reshapes how you see specific moments within it. The Boss Baby Family Business had a production journey that was significantly shaped by the pandemic years. The film had been in development since shortly after the original's success in 2017, and much of its production overlapped with the global disruptions of 2020 and 2021 that affected the entire animation industry. Unlike live-action filmmaking, which could be paused and resumed with relative manageability, animated production operates on pipeline systems that require teams to work in close coordination across multiple departments simultaneously, and moving those pipelines to remote work environments created challenges that required creative problem solving at every level. What is remarkable, and this is the first of the behind the scenes details that reshapes how you watch the film, is that the visual cohesion and tonal consistency of the finished product shows almost no evidence of these disruptions. The film looks and feels like a unified vision rather than a collaborative scramble, which speaks to the strength of McGrath's direction and the experience of DreamWorks Animation's production leadership. The decision to age up the Templeton brothers and center the story on an adult relationship rather than returning to the child versus baby dynamic of the original was a deliberate creative risk, and it was one that was debated significantly during development. There were versions of the story, apparently, that kept the adult Tim and Ted more peripheral and focused more centrally on the next generation, on Tabitha and Tina as the primary protagonists. the version that was ultimately made, invests deeply in the brothers themselves as emotional leads, and that choice is where the film's real power comes from. The next generation storyline is compelling and important, but it works because it is anchored to the older story rather than replacing it. Knowing that this balance was argued over and deliberately chosen rather than simply arrived at makes the final result feel more considered, more earned. James Marsden's casting as adult Tim is worth pausing on specifically because the recasting from Tobey Maguire, who voiced adult Tim in the original, was a notable change and one that required the audience to accept a new vocal identity for a character they had already formed a relationship with. Marsden brings warmth and a particular kind of accessible vulnerability that Maguire's more closed, more interior quality did not. The choice reflects the film's intention to make adult Tim more emotionally present, more readable in his grief about his relationship with Ted. The casting shift is not just pragmatic, it is thematic. The man who voices Tim in this film is a man you believe could want connection more than he wants to seem fine. That distinction is small on paper and significant on screen. The design of the Acorn Center, the film's primary visual environment, went through numerous iterations before arriving at the version you see in the finished film. Early designs were apparently more conventionally ominous, more obviously sinister in their visual language. The decision to make the school beautiful, to make it aspirational in its surfaces, to make it the kind of institution that parents would genuinely want for their children before they understood what it actually was, that decision was made relatively late in the design process, and it is the correct one. It makes the revelation of what the school actually represents more genuinely unsettling because you have been made to want it before you have been shown its cost. The film was originally intended for theatrical release and was announced as such, but the ongoing state of cinema during the pandemic led to a simultaneous release in theaters and on Peacock, the NBC Universal streaming platform, in July 2021. This hybrid release strategy was one that several studios employed during this period as a response to the uncertainties of theatrical attendance, and it had complicated consequences for how the film's commercial performance was measured and understood. We will return to those consequences when we look at how the world received this film, but it is worth noting here that the production team made a film that was designed and built for a theatrical experience, for a large screen, for a communal space, for the particular kind of surrender that comes from being in a darkened room with other people. The fact that most of its audience encountered it on a laptop or a television does not diminish the film, but it does mean that most of us probably experienced it at below the resolution it was intended to be felt at. There is a particular technical achievement in the film that I want to name specifically because it rarely gets named. The de-aging sequences, the visual work of rendering Alec Baldwin and James Marsden as animated children, required the animation team to solve an unusual problem. How do you make a digital child look like a specific adult without crossing into the uncanny valley that makes a character feel wrong rather than young? The solution they arrived at involves a series of subtle choices about proportionality, facial structure, and movement vocabulary that anchor each child character in the visual DNA of their adult counterpart while still feeling genuinely young rather than simply small. It is delicate work and it succeeds. When you see child Tim, you believe he is Tim. When you see child Ted, you believe he is Ted. That belief is the foundation of the film's entire emotional second half, and it was built by animators solving a technical challenge with craft and intelligence. One more piece of production context that I find particularly resonant. Tom McGrath has spoken in interviews about the personal nature of the sibling relationship at the center of these films, and about the way his own experience of brotherhood, of having a sibling, and of watching that relationship change as both of you grew into adults with separate lives and separate identities, informed the emotional territory the Boss Baby films returned to. This is not a case of a director processing trauma through art. It is quieter than that. It is a case of a director bringing genuine lived knowledge to a story, of knowing from the inside what it feels like to love someone and also to have drifted from them, and of finding in that very ordinary and very human experience something worth examining on screen. That personal investment is, I think, part of why the emotional register of these films holds up under scrutiny. The feeling is not borrowed from other films, it comes from somewhere new. And so the film was made, and then it was released into the world. And here is where the story of the boss baby family business becomes more complicated than any purely artistic account of it would suggest. Because the world that received this film was not a neutral world, was not a stable world, was not a world that was simply waiting at its local multiplex with its popcorn and its willingness to be moved. The world that received this film in July of 2021 was a world that was still learning to watch films again, still learning to trust the shared darkness of a cinema after more than a year of being told that sharing any space with other people carried risk. The theatrical experience itself was something people relearning, and that relearning shaped what audiences brought to this film and what they took away from it in ways that are worth sitting with carefully. When The Boss Baby Family Business arrived in theaters on July 2nd, 2021, it did so as part of that complicated transitional moment in cinema's pandemic history. The film opened simultaneously in theaters and on Peacock, NBC Universal streaming service, which was a distribution strategy that reflected both the realities of the market and the uncertainties still surrounding theatrical attendance at that particular moment. This dual release model had been deployed by several major studios during the pandemic period, and it was a strategy that carried real costs alongside its practical benefits. The cost was this: it made a film's commercial performance almost impossible to evaluate in traditional terms. Box office numbers, which had always been an imperfect but widely understood proxy for a film's cultural reach and audience enthusiasm, became even more imperfect as a measuring tool when a significant portion of the potential audience could simply stay home and watch the film on the same day it opened in cinemas. In terms of raw theatrical numbers, the film's opening weekend performance was modest by pre-pandemic standards for a major animated sequel with significant franchise recognition. The film earned approximately $14 million domestically in its opening weekend, which placed it at the top of the domestic box office, but which was by the benchmarks of what a DreamWorks animation sequel of this scale would have been expected to earn in the theatrical environment of 2017 or 2019, a relatively understated figure. The film went on to earn approximately $80 million in its global theatrical run. Again, a number that reads as underwhelming against the original film's theatrical gross of approximately $500 million worldwide, but a number that becomes more complex and more interesting when you account for the fact that a very large proportion of the film's actual audience encountered it through the streaming platform rather than through the box office. Here is what I find genuinely interesting about this commercial story, and why it matters to how we think about this film in retrospect. The conventional narrative that emerged in the trade press and in popular film commentary in the weeks following its release was a narrative of underperformance of a sequel that had not matched the reach or the enthusiasm of its predecessor. And there is truth in that narrative. The two release strategy did split the audience in ways that the numbers confirm. But that narrative is incomplete, and its incompleteness matters because it shaped how critics and commentators framed the film in the months and years that followed, and that framing affected how many people chose to seek out or avoid it. Films that are framed as underperformers carry that framing with them into their streaming lives, and the framing becomes self-reinforcing. It tells potential audiences that the film is not worth their time before they have had the chance to decide that for themselves. What the streaming numbers told a different story about, and streaming platforms frustratingly rarely release their data in forms that allow the kind of precise analysis that box office data does, was the film's genuine and sustained audience reach through Peacock and subsequently through Netflix, where it arrived later and found a very wide audience indeed. Parents with young children, which is the primary demographic for this kind of film, showed a marked tendency during the pandemic period to prefer the at-home viewing option, not because they were less enthusiastic about the film, but because the practicalities of taking children to a cinema during a period of ongoing health anxiety were simply prohibitive for many families. The audience was there, the enthusiasm was real. It expressed itself differently than it had for the original, in a different channel, through a different interface, and the conventional metrics did not capture it accurately. This matters beyond the numbers, and here is why I keep returning to it. Critical reception of films in this period was shaped, more than critics usually acknowledged, by the conditions of viewing. Films that critics screened at home, on laptops, or on domestic television sets, in the fragmented attention economy of home viewing, rather than the sustained focus of a darkened cinema, were films that critics were evaluating at a disadvantage. Their craft of family business, the deliberate and considered visual language, the layered sound design, the way color and space communicate meaning, was built for a larger screen and a more focused viewing experience. Watching it on a laptop is watching it through a keyhole. You can still see the room, but you cannot feel the room, and the difference between seeing and feeling is everything in cinema. I say this not to excuse the film's shortcomings, which are real and which I have named honestly, but to note that the critical conversation around this film was conducted partly under conditions that were suboptimal for appreciating what the film was actually doing. The critical response itself was, as is often the case with animated sequels, divided along lines that had as much to do with critics' prior dispositions toward the original and toward animated filmmaking generally as they did with the specific qualities of the film being reviewed. Among critics who had found the first film unexpectedly moving and thematically rich, the reception of the sequel tended toward cautious appreciation, a recognition that the film was attempting something genuine and achieving it more often than not, accompanied by the measured reservation that it did not quite match the freshness and coherence of the original. This is a fair assessment, and it is one I share. Among critics who had been more dismissive of the first film, who had seen it as clever but shallow, as a high concept premise deployed without sufficient emotional substance, the sequel received similarly skeptical treatment, with the added complaint that it was trying too hard to be emotionally serious for a film whose premise remained fundamentally absurd. This critic, I would argue, misunderstands something important about how comedy and pathos can coexist and strengthen each other, but it is a coherent position even if it is not one I hold. The aggregate critical score the film received, sitting in the range of 65 to 70% positive across major review aggregation platforms, placed it in the zone of qualified approval, which is perhaps the most creatively honest place a film like this can land. Not triumphant, not dismissed, appreciated with reservations, which is the appropriate response to a film that is genuinely trying to do something difficult and succeeds at it imperfectly. The disconnect between critical response and audience response was, as with the original, more pronounced than usual. Audience scores on the major platforms ran significantly higher than critic scores, consistently in the range of 80 to 85% positive, which tells a story about what audiences were bringing to the film and what they found when they arrived. Families watching this film together, parents sitting next to children, and finding that the film was addressing them directly and honestly, even through its comedy and spectacle, responded with a warmth that the more analytically distanced critical response did not fully capture. This gap is not evidence that critics are wrong and audiences are right, or vice versa. It is evidence that this film was doing two different things for two different kinds of engagement, and that both things were being done with genuine skill, and that which thing you noticed and valued depended on what you came looking for. The awards season story for Family Business is brief and somewhat instructive. The film received an Annie Award nomination, the Annie Awards being the animation industry's primary self-honoring institution, in several technical categories, reflecting the genuine craft achievements I have described at length. It did not make the Academy Award shortlist for Best Animated Feature, which was not a surprise given the competition in that particular year and the general tendency of the Academy's animation branch to favor films that carry a certain kind of prestige, signaling that franchise sequels, regardless of their actual quality, rarely carry. This is a structural bias in how animation is evaluated at the award level, and it affects not just this film but many animated works of genuine substance that never receive the recognition their craft deserves. The Boss Baby franchise is perceived by the people who make these determinations as fundamentally commercial animation rather than artistic animation, and that perception functions as a closed door regardless of what any specific installment achieves. I find this frustrating, and I name it here not as a complaint on behalf of a specific film, but as an observation about how our cultural frameworks for evaluating animation continue to underserve the form. What happened in the streaming afterlife of The Boss Baby? Family Business is, in many ways, the more interesting and more honest account of its cultural life. When the film arrived on Netflix, reaching an audience that was potentially global in scope rather than limited by the availability of Peacock subscriptions, which were concentrated in specific markets, it found its real audience. It entered the most watched lists in multiple territories. It was the kind of film that parents watched with their children and then found themselves thinking about afterward, the kind of film that prompted the conversations between adults about their own siblings, their own relationships, their own sense of how much of who they were to the people they loved had been quietly displaced by the accumulating weight of ordinary life. These conversations did not happen on review aggregation platforms. They happened at dinner tables and in text message threads and in the half awake processing of a late evening. They were not counted. But they were real and they mattered to the film's true legacy. Now let us place this film within the larger story of which it is a part, because Family Business does not exist in isolation. It exists within a franchise, within a series of artistic decisions that began with the original film in 2017 and that have continued in the years since, most notably through The Boss Baby, Back in the Crib, the Netflix animated series that extended the universe further into the domestic and streaming landscape. Understanding where Family Business stands within this larger narrative requires a clear account of what the original film established and what this film chose to do with that inheritance. The original Boss Baby of 2017 was, at its core, a film about a very specific and very universal childhood terror, the terror of displacement. It was told from Tim's perspective, from the perspective of the child who already exists, and who suddenly must share his parents' love and attention with a new arrival. And it used the fantastical conceit of the corporate baby to externalize that terror and make it visible and comedic, and ultimately emotionally resolvable. The film understood that sibling rivalry is not really about the sibling, it is about the child's fear that love is a finite resource that can be depleted, that parents have only so much of it to give, and that the arrival of a new claimant necessarily means less for the one who was there first. It resolved that fear as the best family films do, not by dismissing it but by walking through it, by allowing Tim and Ted to genuinely oppose each other before genuinely needing each other, and by finding on the other side of that opposition something that was worth more than uncontested love, partnership, mutual recognition, the particular warmth of being chosen by someone who was once your rival. That is a complete and coherent emotional arc, and the original film executes it with considerable skill. What Family Business inherits from it is not the specific conflict, that conflict has been resolved, but the underlying emotional architecture, the idea that the people we are closest to are often the people we have stopped truly seeing, and that the work of love is not just the initial choosing, but the ongoing practice of remaining present and known. The sequel takes the resolution of the original and asks what happens next. What happens after you have chosen each other, after you have passed through the crisis of non-recognition and come out the other side? What happens to relationship when life simply continues, when the dramatic urgency that forced honesty and intimacy is replaced by the ordinary accumulation of days, when neither person is doing anything wrong exactly, and yet the closeness is slowly, imperceptibly leaking away? This is, I want to argue, a more difficult emotional subject than the one the first film addressed. Sibling rivalry is a story we all recognize immediately, and it has a clear narrative shape, a beginning of conflict, a middle of escalation, an end of resolution. The story of drifting, of two people who love each other genuinely but who have stopped maintaining that love with active intention, does not have the same clean shape. It is not a conflict story. It is a quiet story about what is lost when nothing is particularly wrong. It does not have a villain in the relational sense, only in the external plot sense. The distance between Tim and Ted is not anyone's fault, and no one can be held responsible for it, and that absence of fault makes it harder to address and harder to dramatize. Family Business finds a way to dramatize it through the adventure plot, through the forced proximity and the de-aging and the necessity of collaboration, and the craft of the screenplay is in how it uses the external mechanics of the plot to create the internal conditions for the relational story to unfold. The adventure is not a distraction from the emotional truth, it is the delivery mechanism for it. What Family Business adds to the franchise conversation that was not present in the original is a generational dimension. Tim is now a father, Ted is a father. The family is no longer just the two brothers and their parents. It has expanded forward in time into a new generation, and with that expansion comes a new set of questions. What do we pass on? What do our children inherit from us that we did not choose to give them? When Tabitha is described as exceptional, as a child who is capable of more than almost anyone around her, the film is quietly asking whether this exceptionalism is a gift or a weight, and what responsibility her father has toward it, and whether Tim's tendency toward warmth and presence over achievement and ambition is the thing that Tabitha needs from him, or the thing that she is quietly frustrated by. These are not questions the original film needed to ask. They are questions that only become available when the characters have grown, when time has done its work on them, and the franchise's decision to take its characters seriously enough to let them age and change and accumulate experience is one of its most distinctive and admirable qualities. There is also a conversation this film opens within the franchise context about the institution of babyhood itself, about what the baby corp mythology says about how we imagine childhood as a kind of prelapsarian state of competence and clarity that adulthood ruins. In the mythology of these films, babies are not innocent and helpless. They are, in fact, more capable, more intelligent, more strategically sophisticated than the others who care for them. They are running a corporation. They have operational command of resources that adults cannot access, and then they grow up and they forget, and they become ordinary. This mythology is, on one level, a purely comedic conceit, but on another level, it is a meditation on a very real cultural anxiety, the anxiety that growing up means losing something irretrievable, that the child we were is wiser or more essentially ourselves than the adult we become. The franchise returns to this anxiety again and again, and Family Business engages with it most directly through the character of Armstrong, whose villainy is rooted in his refusal to accept the terms of that loss. Understanding Armstrong within the franchise mythology as the shadow version of what the franchise's thesis could become if taken to its logical extreme, if the nostalgia for childhood became not a source of reconnection but a justification for preventing growth, is one of the more interesting things the second film contributes to the larger conversation. What about the franchise's future? The Boss Baby, Back in the Crib, the Netflix series that followed Family Business, took the universe in a different direction, focusing on Ted, now de-aged back to babyhood in a domestic setting, navigating family life while secretly maintaining his corporate identity. The series has its own pleasures and its own distinct energy, and it represents an extension of the world rather than a continuation of the specific emotional story that the films tell. As a piece of franchise architecture, Family Business functions as both a conclusion and an opening. It closes the specific arc of Tim and Ted's adult estrangement and potential reconciliation while opening the door to a world that is larger and more populated than the one the original film established. Whether the franchise continues in film form, whether there will be a third tragical boss baby, is something that the commercial story of Family Business has made uncertain rather than inevitable. But the emotional story of these two films taken together forms something complete. A diptych about what brotherhood means across a lifetime, about how you lose it and how you find it again, about the specific grace of being known by someone who knew you before you became the person you are now. Now I want to go somewhere deeper. I want to step away from the franchise context and the commercial story and the craft analysis, and I want to sit with what this film is actually about, not what it says it is about, not what its plot mechanics are about, but what it is truly, quietly, persistently about underneath everything else. Because there is a film beneath this film. There is a film that exists in the spaces between the jokes, in the silences between the action sequences, in the particular quality of light in certain scenes, and the particular quality of weight in certain performances. And that film is about something that I find genuinely moving and genuinely important and genuinely rare in animated cinema or in any cinema directed at families. Here is what this film understands. It understands that love is not a feeling. It understands that love is a practice. It understands that the difference between a relationship that sustains and a relationship that calcifies is not the intensity of feeling in any given moment, but the consistency of attention over time. The daily, unglamorous, unremarkable choice to remain present to another person, even when presence is not dramatic and does not ask anything of you and earns no particular recognition. Tim and Ted love each other. There is never any doubt about this in the film, and the film wisely does not manufacture that doubt, does not create a scene where their love itself is threatened or questioned. What the film shows instead is that love without attention becomes love without contact. It becomes something that lives in the past tense even while both parties believe it to be present. You love each other in memory, in shared history, in the warmth you feel when you think about the person. But you have stopped actually encountering each other, stopped being genuinely surprised by each other, stopped discovering anything new in each other. And this is where the film is doing something rare. It is saying that the tragedy of neglected relationships is not hatred or rejection or betrayal. It is that nothing has gone wrong. It is that everything is fine. And in that fineness, something irreplaceable is slowly, quietly dying. Think about what that means for a film aimed at families watching together on a weekend afternoon. Think about the parents in the room watching Tim and Ted and recognizing themselves, recognizing their own brothers or sisters or childhood friends or spouses or parents, recognizing the specific texture of a relationship that has become maintained rather than felt. Think about the children in the room watching and not yet having the conceptual framework to understand what they are seeing, but feeling it anyway, feeling the film's sadness at the edges of its comedy, feeling the weight of something they cannot yet name. And think about what happens when those two groups, the parents who understand and the children who feel, watch this film together in the same space and share the experience of it. The film creates a moment of cross generational emotional recognition that is one of the most valuable things any art can create. A moment where people of different ages and different experiences are moved by the same thing for different reasons and find themselves in that shared moving briefly and genuinely close to each other. This is what the best family cinema has always aspired to and rarely achieved. It is the ambition behind every Pixar film, behind the films of Hayao Miyazaki, behind the work of the great animators who understood that animation is not a children's medium but a universal one, that the line between a film for children and a film for adults is drawn by cowards and dissolved by artists. Family business belongs to this tradition, not in every frame and not with the consistency of the very greatest examples, but in its best moments, in the moments when it is entirely itself and entirely honest. It achieves something that most animated films and most films of any kind do not attempt. The symbol that the film returns to most persistently, and symbols in cinema are not decorative, they are structural. They are the architecture of meaning beneath the architecture of plot, is the symbol of the briefcase, the boss baby's briefcase. It is present in both films, and in Family Business it carries more accumulated weight than it did in the original, because we now understand what the briefcase represents: the authority of professionalism, the armor of competence, the tools that a person who has decided that being good at things is safer than being open to people carries with them into every room. That briefcase is not just a prop, it is a portrait of a personality, It tells you everything about who Ted has become and why, about a baby who was sent into the world to do a job and who has never quite been able to put down the job, who has confused the doing of things with the being of a person, who has surrounded himself with the markers of effectiveness because effectiveness is measurable and love is not. The moment when the briefcase becomes irrelevant, when Ted is a child again and has nothing but himself and his brother and the accumulated knowledge of what their relationship used to be, is the moment when the symbol completes itself. The film has been building toward the dissolution of the briefcase's power from its first scene, and when that dissolution happens, it happens not through a dramatic speech or a climactic confrontation, but through the simple experience of being young again, of not having the briefcase because children do not carry briefcases, of discovering that without the armor you are still there, that the person underneath the professional apparatus is still recognizable and still worth knowing and still capable of being loved for himself rather than for his competitor. And so let me set the arc. This is the film's central gift to Ted, and it is delivered not as a lesson but as a physical experience. He does not learn it, he lives it. And there is a profound wisdom in the choice to deliver the film's emotional core through embodied experience rather than verbal insight, because what the film is saying is true of real emotional change. You do not think your way to it, you live your way to it. The motif of childhood games, of the specific rituals and languages that brothers develop between themselves, the private jokes and the coded references and the ways of being together that belong only to their particular relationship, runs through the film as a kind of emotional watermark, visible most clearly when you hold the film up to the light. These games are not just nostalgic decoration, they are evidence of intimacy. They are proof that at some point Tim and Ted knew each other with a specificity and a completeness that adult life has not replicated, and that the knowledge is still there, still available, like a language you learned as a child and stopped speaking, and then discover one day, in the company of someone who also knows it, that you have not forgotten. The scene where Tim and Ted rediscover one of these games. I am being deliberately vague here because we are still in pre-spoiler territory, has a quality that I can only describe as relief. The emotional experience of watching it is relief, the specific relief of finding something you did not know you had lost. There is also woven through the film with real intelligence, a meditation on what it means to be exceptional, and this meditation is more nuanced than the word exceptional usually allows. Both of the new generation characters in this film, Tabitha and Tina, are exceptional in different ways, and the film is honest about the different costs and different textures of different kinds of exceptionalism. Tabitha's exceptionalism is intellectual and social. She is ahead of her peers, she is noticed, she is cultivated and encouraged by institutions that want to harness her gifts for their own purposes, and the film is quietly suspicious of those institutions and their motives in a way that feels very contemporary, very alert to the way that educational and corporate environments can instrumentalize gifted children rather than simply supporting them. Tina's exceptionalism is operational. She is the new boss baby, competent and strategic and effective in the specific ways that the baby cop apparatus trains and rewards, and she is funny about it and aware of it and slightly uncomfortable with the adult world's tendency to flatten her into her role. Both of these children are in their different ways lonely in their exceptionalism. Both of them need to be known as people rather than as functions. And the film's kindness toward both of them, its refusal to ask them to be less than they are, its insistence that what they need is not diminishment but genuine relationship, is one of its most quietly radical positions. What does it mean to be truly known? This is the question that runs beneath every other question in this film, and it is a question that the film approaches from multiple angles without ever reducing it to a simple answer. Tim knows Ted as his brother. He knows the Ted of childhood, the Ted of shared history, the Ted that existed before either of them had built the protective architectures of adult identity around themselves. But he does not know the Ted who walks into a room now. He does not know what Ted fears, or what Ted misses, or what Ted misses, or what Ted looks like when he is genuinely happy rather than professionally satisfied. And Ted, by the same token, knows Tim as the boy he grew up with, but not as the man he has become, does not know what fatherhood has done to him, what his relationship with Tabitha costs him in the specific daily way that parenting exceptional children costs something, what the warmth and presence that Tim offers his children has required him to practice and build in himself rather than simply having born with. This is the film's most important insight, and it is one that it earns through the plot device of the aging rather than simply stating it. To know each other now, you have to know each other then. Not because the past is more real than the present, not because who you were as children is who you truly are, but because the child you were is the foundation that the adult was built on, and you cannot understand the building without seeing the foundation. When Tim and Ted are children, again, they are not regressing, they are excavating. They are going back to the place where they last had access to each other without armor, and they are finding there the tools for knowing each other differently in the present. The de-aging is not a fantasy of return, it is a method of access, and that distinction is crucial to how the film means. The idea that is most persistently and most beautifully present in the visual language of this film, and which I have approached from multiple angles already and want now to address directly, is the idea that love requires maintenance, not dramatic renewal, not grand gestures, not the crisis that forces proximity and honest confession, simply maintenance, the quiet, daily, often invisible work of staying interested in another person, of asking real questions rather than comfortable ones, of being willing to be surprised by someone you think you know entirely. This idea does not announce itself. It lives in the texture of the film, in the way Tim and Ted talk to each other in the film's early scenes, which is the talk of people who are comfortable rather than closed, who have settled into a groove that is easy precisely because it does not ask anything new of either of them. The film notices discomfort and names it gently as a kind of failure, not a moral failure but a failure of imagination, an unwillingness to keep discovering someone who has become familiar. And it makes you wonder, as good films always make you wonder, about your own relationships, about the people in your life whose familiarity you have mistaken for knowledge, about the questions you stopped asking because you assumed you already knew the answers. Now let us talk about the cultural moment this film arrived into, because films do not exist outside history, and the history that surrounded this film's arrival is not incidental to how it was received or what it meant or why it resonated in the particular ways that it did. The Boss Baby Family Business was released in July 2021, which is to say that it arrived at a specific and strange inflection point in the cultural life of the pandemic. Vaccines had been distributed widely enough in many parts of the world, particularly in the United States, which was the film's primary market, that the immediate crisis had begun to feel for many people like something that was transitioning from active emergency to managed aftermath. People were beginning to return to something that resembled ordinary life, and that return was accompanied by a particular emotional complexity that has been written about and discussed extensively, but which I want to name here in the specific context of what this film was offering its audience. The pandemic years had done something to the human experience of time and relationship that is worth sitting with. The forced proximity of lockdown had, for many families, produced an unexpected and often disorienting intimacy. Suddenly, parents and children and siblings and spouses were spending more time in each other's physical company than any of them had experienced since early childhood, and this proximity had in many cases revealed how much the busyness of ordinary life had been serving as a substitute for genuine presence. People had discovered in the enforced stillness of lockdown that they had been in the same physical spaces as their loved ones for years without truly being together, without truly attending to each other, without truly knowing each other in the daily, ongoing way that closeness requires. And then, as the pandemic moved into its later phases, many of these same people were returning to the busyness, to the commutes and the social calendars and the professional obligations, and discovering that the intimacy revealed by the forced proximity was beginning to fade again, that the habits of disconnection were reasserting themselves with surprising ease. into this specific cultural and emotional moment arrived a film about two brothers who had drifted from each other through the accumulation of ordinary business, who had confused the maintenance of a calendar relationship with the maintenance of a true one, who had lost access to each other not through conflict or estrangement, but simply through the persistent pressure of lives that were too full to leave room for the kind of attention that real closeness requires. The resonance was not accidental. The film did not set out to address the pandemic. It was in production long before the pandemic's full scope was understood, and its themes were rooted in the first film's emotional architecture rather than in any reading of the specific cultural moment. But the specific cultural moment was there in the audience when the film arrived, and it met the film's themes with a readiness and a personal recognition that a film about the same subject, released in 2018, might not have encountered in quite the same way. This is one of the things I find most fascinating about the cultural life of films. The way that the meaning of film has for its audience is never determined solely by the film itself, but always in part by the world that receives it. A film is a fixed object. It does not change once it has been made and released, but its meaning is not fixed because its meaning is made in the encounter between the film and its audience, and audience change. The audience that watched Family Business in July 2021 was an audience that had just spent over a year being forced to confront the state of its own relationships, that had either deepened those relationships through the intimacy of shared crisis or had discovered in the crisis how thin some of those connections had already become. That audience brought to the film a personal investment in its themes that a pre-pandemic audience might not have had in quite the same way, and that investment is part of why the film's emotional register landed with as much force as it did for the people who were genuinely moved by it, which was, I would argue, more people than the critical and commercial narrative gave credit for. There is also, in the cultural context of this film, something worth naming about the specific moment in which ideas about family and parenthood and what constitutes a good childhood were being actively and sometimes contentiously renegotiated. The pandemic had disrupted schooling in ways that forced millions of parents to become actively involved in their children's education in ways they had not previously been, and this disruption had produced a complex range of responses. Some parents discovering a deeper engagement with their children's intellectual and emotional lives, others discovering the extent to which the educational system had been carrying responsibilities that they were not equipped to take on at home. The film's portrayal of Tabitha's school as an institution that is on the surface aspirational and in practice something more controlling and more sinister, an institution that identifies exceptional children and then shapes their exceptionalism for its own purposes rather than for theirs, arrived in a cultural moment when parents were more alert than usual to questions about what schools were actually doing with and to their children. This reading of the film does not reduce it to a piece of cultural commentary, but it does help explain why the film's institutional villain registered with as much discomfort as it did for adult audiences, why Armstrong's school felt genuinely threatening in a way that a cartoon villain operating a cartoon institution in a less charged cultural moment might not have. The film also participates in a way that is gentle rather than polemical in a conversation that was present in the cultural air of 2021 about what adulthood means and whether the path from childhood to adulthood that prior generations had described and prescribed was still the inevitable or desirable one. There is in Armstrong's philosophy, stripped of its villainy, considered purely as a set of ideas, something that resonates with a generation that had grown up being told that the markers of adult achievement were the measures of a life well lived, and that had found, on actually reaching those markers, that they were not sufficient and were not, in many cases, even real. The idea that adulthood represents loss rather than gain, that growing up requires surrendering something essential rather than simply acquiring things, was not purely a villain's idea in the cultural moment of 2021. It was an idea that great many people were living. And the film's response to that idea which is not to dismiss it but to redirect it, to say that what adulthood costs you in innocence and freedom it can, if you attend to it carefully, return to you in depth and wisdom and a specific richness of fully inhabited relationships, was a response that the cultural moment needed and that the film was positioned to offer. What has this film left behind in the cultural conversation? Does it feel timeless or of its time? I want to sit with this question for a moment before I answer it, because I think the honest answer is more complex than either option suggests. The themes of family business, the drift between siblings, the loss and recovery of intimacy, the question of what we pass on to our children and what we owe to each other as adults who are once children together. These are themes of permanent human relevance. They are not tied to any specific historical moment. They are the themes of the great films about family and time, of Tokyo Story, of Ordinary People, of the Toy Story films, of every work of art that has ever tried to say something true about how love changes over time and what it costs to maintain it. In that sense, family business participates in a conversation that is older than cinema and that will outlast it. Its emotional core does not date. What is of its time is the specific texture of the disconnection it portrays. The way that Tim and Ted's drift from each other is enabled and accelerated by the particular conditions of early 21st century adult life, by the professional busyness and the geographical mobility and the social media simulacrum of connection that allows you to feel informed about someone's life without actually being close to them. The film's portrayal of a relationship that is maintained through the mechanisms of digital contact, through the scheduled calls and the coordinated holiday appearances and the mutual social media awareness, while the actual intimacy drains away, is a portrait of a very specific contemporary pathology, one that previous generations did not have in quite the same form. In this sense, the film is precisely of its time, and 30 years from now it will carry a period quality that will make it recognizable as a document of early 21st century relationship patterns in the way that films of the 1980s carry recognizable period qualities about how families communicated and disconnected in that particular era. But the pain it portrays, the ache of knowing someone and no longer quite reaching them, of loving someone and not quite feeling it as actively as you once did, that pain has no era. That pain is the human condition dressed in contemporary clothes, and films that can find the timeless inside the specific, that can dress permanent truth in period texture, are films that endure. They endure because each generation recognizes the permanent truth, even as the period texture becomes historical, even as the specific mechanisms of disconnection change, while the disconnection itself remains constant. This film will endure in this way. I am confident of that. Not as a great film, I am too honest about its imperfections to make that claim, but as a film that told a true thing in a moment when the truth was needed, and that did so with enough craft and enough heart that the truth will outlast the moment it was told in. That is not nothing, that is in fact a great deal. And this brings me to the broader cultural conversation this film participates in, which is the conversation about what animated cinema is for and what it can do and who it is allowed to address. Because here is the thing about this film that most of its critical reception missed or chose not to engage with. It is not a film that condescends to its audience in any direction. It does not condescend to children by simplifying its emotional content to the point of meaninglessness, and it does not condescend to adults by winking at them over the children's heads, by making the adult content a separate register that children are not supposed to access. What it does, and this is the thing that the best animated filmmaking has always done and that most animated filmmaking does not do, is trust that emotional truth is legible at multiple levels simultaneously. A child watching this film feels the story of Tim and Ted as a story about right now, about what it feels like to love someone and not have them understand you, about what it feels like to want closeness and not to know how to ask for it, about the specific emotional experience of sharing space with someone you love who is not truly there with you. An adult watching this film feels those same things and recognizes them as coming from a different place in their own lives, as belonging to experiences they have already had, rather than ones they are still waiting to have. The film speaks to both of them honestly and simultaneously, and it does not require either of them to pretend they are the other. This is what animated cinema at its absolute best does. This is what Miyazaki does in My Neighbor Totoro, what Pixar did in the Toy Story films, and in Inside Out, what every animator who has ever understood the form as a vehicle for genuine feeling rather than for visual spectacle has done. You do not make a film for children and hide adult content in it. You make a film about the human experience and trust that children and adults will encounter it from different points in their own journeys and find different truths in it that are all nevertheless real. Family business belongs to this tradition. It does not reach the heights of the tradition's greatest examples, but it belongs there, and belonging there is something worth naming and worth honoring. One last thought on what this film is saying, and then we will move on. The film's title is a pun, as the original's was, Family Business. The business of family, the work, the labor, the practice of it, the ongoing operational demands of maintaining relationships and raising children and being present to the people who need you. But also the boss baby sense of business, the corporate world, the professional apparatus, the thing that Ted has substituted for family in the emotional economy of his adult life. The title contains the film's thesis. It says the business of family is the business that matters. It says all the other business, the hedge funds and the corner offices and the professional accomplishments and the impressive adult lives, is secondary and derivative and ultimately hollow if the family business is not attended to. This is not a new idea, it is one of the oldest ideas in storytelling. But the film earns the right to that old idea by arriving at it through lived experience rather than stated wisdom, by showing you what it costs rather than telling you what it means. And that distinction between showing and telling, between earned truth and asserted truth, is ultimately what separates cinema from instruction, and what makes the best films feel like experience rather than argument. From this moment, we go into full spoilers. If you have not yet seen this film, stop here, go experience it first and come back. Some things deserve to be felt before they are understood. Still here? Good. Then let us go all the way. Let us take this film apart with the reverence and the precision it deserves, and let us look at every moment that made us feel something, and let us ask not just what happened, but why it happened, why it was constructed the way it was, why the people who made this film made the specific choices they made in the specific sequence they made them, and what those choices cost and what they gave back. Because this is where the essay becomes something different. This is where we stop standing at the edge of the film and walk into the middle of it. This is where the real conversation begins. Let me start at the beginning. Not the narrative beginning. I want to start with the film's actual opening image, the image that precedes everything. The image that the film chooses to show you before it has shown you anything else. Because the first image of a film is a promise. It is the filmmaker saying, this is the kind of film I am making, this is the kind of experience I am offering you, this is what you should bring with you and what you should be prepared to feel. The first image of the boss baby family business is not an action image. It is not a joke. It is not a spectacle. It is an image of time. Specifically, it is image of the Templeton family home, the house where Tim grew up. The house where Tim and Ted were brothers in the fullest and most daily sense of that word, rendered in the warm, slightly soft palette of memory rather than the sharper palette of the present tense. And the film lingers there. It does not rush. It lets you look at the house and feel what the house means before it shows you anything that has happened inside it. This is a choice that costs screen time and earns emotional credit. In the economy of a family animation sequel with a busy plot and a 90-minute runtime, spending your opening seconds on a patient, unhurried image of an empty house is a risk. But the film has calculated the risk correctly, because the house is not really a house. It is a symbol, and the film knows it is a symbol, and it is trusting you to know it too. The house is the past. The house is childhood. The house is the shared space that Tim and Ted both originated from, the common ground they began on before their separate lives pulled them into separate territories. Showing you the house first is the film saying, before we show you who these people are now, we want you to hold where they came from. We want you to carry that origin with you to everything that follows. And because the film has asked you to carry it, you do. You carry the house through every scene of adult busyness and professional accomplishment and comfortable disconnection, and it sits in the back of your awareness like a memory you did not know you were holding. From the house, the film moves into the present, and the present is rendered in a palette that is noticeably different, more saturated, more defined, more busy. We meet adult Tim, and the film is immediately honest about who he is and what he has become. Tim is one. Tim is present. Tim is a good father in the daily, hands on, emotionally engaged way that is not flashy but is deeply valuable, the kind of fatherhood that does not make a noise about itself because it is simply how Tim moves through the world rather than a performance he puts on. He is clearly, visibly, happily entangled with his daughters, with Tabitha, who is 11 and exceptional and slightly lonely in her exceptionalism, and with little Tina, who is still a baby in the ordinary domestic sense of the word, meaning that Tim does not yet know what his youngest daughter is and what she is capable of. And here is the first thing the film does that is structurally brilliant and that sets up everything that follows. It uses Tim's relationship with Tabitha to mirror, in advance, the relationship between Tim and Ted that the film will later examine and attempt to heal. Tim loves Tabitha completely and without reservation, and Tabitha knows this, and it is not enough. Not because Tim has failed her, he has not failed her, but because the love Tim offers is the love of a father for a child, which is necessarily a love that looks backward at who Tabitha was and who Tim wants her to remain, rather than forward at who she is becoming and who she needs to be met as. Tim wants to preserve something. He wants to keep Tabitha in the version of herself that is still accessible to him, the version that wants to watch old movies with him and share his enthusiasms and inhabit the world through his particular lens. And Tabitha, who is 11 and becoming more herself every day, is moving beyond that version and cannot help it, and does not want to be held back by it even as she also, with the specific longing of an exceptional child who is slightly ahead of her peers, wants more than anything to simply feel known. This is the film's first emotional proposition, and it is a brave one. That parental love, even very good parental love, can be a form of not seen. That the love that holds on is sometimes the love that forecloses. That Tim, who is such a good father in so many ways, is failing his daughter not through cruelty or negligence or selfishness, but through the most forgivable and most human of failures, the failure to let her be someone he does not yet recognize. And the film shows you this before it has introduced its plot, before Baby Corp and Tina's mission and the Acorn Center and Dr. Armstrong have entered the story. It shows you this in the texture of ordinary domestic life, in the way Tabitha deflects Tim's attempts at connection with the practiced, gentle, slightly sad efficiency of a child who has stopped expecting to be truly met. This is quiet filmmaking. This is the kind of observation that only comes from caring about characters more than about plot, from spending time with people on the page long enough to understand how they actually move and talk and fail each other without meaning to. When Tina is revealed as the new boss baby, when the film's central plot mechanism arrives, it arrives in a way that manages to be both completely predictable, even the film's premise and its title, and genuinely funny in its execution. The timing of Tina's reveal is impeccable. The film has spent just enough time establishing Tim's oblivious, adoring, slightly flustered parental relationship with his younger daughter that when Tina opens her mouth and speaks in the full authoritative, slightly contemptuous tones of a corporate executive in a baby suit, the contrast is immediate and perfect, and the laughter it produces is the laughter of recognition, the specific delight of having the thing you suspected confirmed with more precision and more style than you expected. Amidst their limits, tenants attraction with our limits, but our limits isn't. Whether you are just string in animated cinema matters as much as casting in live action. The voice does everything. Sedaris gives Tina a quality of barely contained impatience with the requirements of babyhood, with the drooling and the crawling and the domestic helplessness that her cover identity demands, that is consistently and specifically funny rather than generically comedic. And this distinction matters because specific comedy earns its laughs while generic comedy merely achieves them. Tina's mission, as she outlines it to Tim with the brisk efficiency of someone who has been briefed and prepared and has no patience for the emotional complexity of the family situation she is operating within, is to infiltrate the Acorn Center for Advanced Child Development, the elite institution that Tabitha attends and that Baby Co-op has identified as a site of suspicious activity. The Acorn Center is run by Doc Irwin Armstrong, and even before we meet Armstrong in person, the film has seeded the environment of his institution with the subtle wrongness I described earlier, with a brightness that is too controlled, a perfection that is too maintained, a quality of ambient aspiration that is slightly more pressurized than inspiring. Walking into the Icon Center, visually, is like walking into a room where the air has been treated. It smells clean and looks clean and feels just slightly lifeless in a way that is hard to name but impossible not to feel. The plan requires Tim to go undercover at the school, and it requires Ted to be brought in as backup, and this is where the film's two narrative threads, the adventure plot and the emotional plot, are first deliberately joined. Tina's baby formula, the technological mechanism that will allow Tim and Ted to revert to childhood, is introduced here, and the film is admirably unself-conscious about the absurdity of this device. It does not try to justify it scientifically or logically. It presents it as a given within the world's internal rules and moves on, which is the correct approach. The absurdity is the point. The specific absurdity of making two grown men children again in order to infiltrate a school is the precise and perfect externalization of what the film is actually attempting to do with them emotionally. It is taking two adults who have been hiding behind their adult identities and adult certainties, and it is stripping all of that away, literally, and returning them to the version of themselves that existed before the protective architectures were built. The formula is not just a plot device, it is the film's thesis made physical, and the decision to use it is the decision to commit fully to the metaphor rather than merely alluding to it. But before the formula is administered, before Tim and Ted become children again, we have the scene that I consider the film's most important scene, and I want to spend real time with it because it earns every second of attention. It is the scene of Tim and Ted meeting again as adults, and it is rendered with a clarity and a patience and a lack of sentimentality that I find genuinely impressive. They meet, they are clearly glad to see each other. They exchange the warm greetings of people who love each other and have not seen each other in a while, and there is real affection in the exchange, real pleasure in the reunion. And then, almost immediately, the condition settles into its groove, the comfortable, well-worn groove of a relationship that has been maintained rather than grown, a groove where each person knows their role and their lines and delivers them with practiced warmth and no real risk. Ted makes a joke. Tim laughs. Tim references something from their shared past. Ted nods with the specific quality of warmth that comes from remembering rather than from feeling in the present tense. Watch this scene carefully and you will see what the film is doing in it. The camera does not editorialize. The performances do not tip into sadness or longing. The scene is played as comfortable, as warm as a perfectly adequate reunion between two brothers who love each other. And yet, and this is the craft, there is something slightly airless about it. There is a quality of rehearsal in the warmth, as though both men have had this reunion before and have gotten good at it. The love is real and the distance is real, and they are happening simultaneously, and neither Tim nor Ted has the language or the framework to name the distance, even though they both, somewhere beneath the practiced warmth of their reunion, feel it. This is the film showing you the problem without stating the problem, which is always the more powerful choice, because when you see something rather than being told it, you own the scene in a way that changes how you carry what you have seen. The de-aging sequence itself, the moment when Tim and Ted actually drink the formula and are returned to their tired bodies, is one of the film's great comic set pieces, and it is constructed with the layered, precise timing that distinguishes the film's best comedy from its more generic moments. The physical comedy of adult personalities in child bodies is deployed here with real intelligence. It is not simply funny because it is absurd, though it is absurd and the absurdity earns genuine laughs, but also because the film uses the physical comedy to begin the emotional work. The moment Ted realizes he is small again, that the briefcase and the suit and the adult authority are simply not available to him in this body, that he is genuinely, physically, inescapably a child, the expression that crosses his face is not just comedic, it is something more interesting than that. It is the expression of someone encountering themselves before the armor was built and not being entirely sure what to do with that encounter. There is a moment shortly after the de-aging that I want to isolate and examine carefully because I think it is the film's most subtle emotional achievement and one that almost no one discusses when they talk about this film. It is a moment where Ted, as a child, reaches for something, a reflex action, the kind of thing you do without thinking. And his hand is smaller than he expects it to be, smaller than he is accustomed to, and he stops. He looks at his hand. Just for a beat, just for a single unhurried beat, he looks at his small child hand, and something crosses his face that the film does not name and does not explain. And I think what is crossing his face in that moment is not comic confusion, though the film will immediately return to comedy. I think what is crossing his face is the specific vertigo of suddenly being returned to the version of yourself that preceded all your choices, all your constructions, all the accumulated decisions and defenses that build the person you are now. I think he is encountering in the smallness of his own hand the self that existed before Ted became Ted the executive, before the briefcase and the authority and the competence that defines him as an adult. And I think the film includes that beat, brief, quiet, easily overlooked, as a kind of declaration of intent. It is saying what happens to these two people over the next hour will happen in this space, in the space of the undefended self. Pay attention to how it feels to be small again. Within the Acorn Center, the film does something that rewards close attention. It systematically shows you the institution from the outside before revealing what it actually is from the inside. And the gap between those two perspectives is where the film's social critique lives. From the outside, the Acorn Center is everything ambitious parents want for their exceptional children: extraordinary resources, attentive staff, an environment that takes children's intelligence seriously and challenges them accordingly. The children here are engaged, they are stimulated, they are seen, or rather, and this is the film's precise and important qualification, they are recognized. Their capabilities are recognized, which is not the same thing as being seen. To be recognized is to have your utility acknowledged. To be seen is to have your whole self acknowledged, including the parts that are not useful and not exceptional and not impressive, including the ordinary, uncertain, sometimes frightened self that lives beneath the gift. Tabitha has been recognized at the Acorn Center. She has not been seen, and when we observe her within the institution, we understand why the recognition is not enough, why being the most capable person in the room, while satisfying in some ways, is also a form of isolation, a form of standing apart from rather than belonging to. Her classmates look at her with admiration and with something very close to awe, which is its own kind of loneliness. Her teachers look at her with the specific attention of people who are invested in her potential, which means they are looking at a future version of her rather than the present version, which means that in every encounter within this institution, Tabitha is being related to as a project rather than as a person. She has internalized this. She carries herself with a competence and a composure that are on close observation protective mechanisms rather than expressions of ease. Tabitha is performing her own exceptionalism because it is the only language the institution provides for self-expression, and the performance is beginning to cost her in ways she has not yet found the language to describe. This is where Tim, in his undercover child identity, becomes unexpectedly important to his own daughter in a way neither of them anticipated. Tim, who is warm and present and genuinely interested in people as people rather than as functions, is exactly what Tabitha's environment has been withholding from her. When Tim, as a child, not as her father, not carrying the specific freight of the parental relationship that has its own complications, simply sits with Tabitha and asks her what she finds difficult rather than what she excels at, the effect on Tabitha is remarkable and the film handles it with real delicacy. She does not immediately soften. She does not immediately open up. She approaches the possibility of genuine connection with the caution of someone who has been burned by unmet expectations before, which is the honest and human response rather than the cinematically convenient one. And this means that when she does begin to open up, when she does begin to trust him as child, with the parts of herself that she has been keeping carefully managed within the institution's recognition economy, the opening feels earned rather than assigned. The relationship that develops between Tim as child and Tabitha is, structurally, a second chance. It is Tim getting to know his daughter outside of the specific constraints of fatherhood, outside the role that both of them have been performing in their relationship, the role of attentive father and capable daughter, and discovering in that outside the role space who she actually is. And the film is generous enough to let this discovery be genuinely mutual. Tabitha also discovers something about her father in this encounter, discovers the warmth and the genuine curiosity and the specific quality of attention that Tim offers, and that she had perhaps been taking for granted, or, more accurately, that she had been receiving in the wrong register. The fatherly warmth that sometimes felt like being held back becomes, when encountered in the mode of simple friendship and genuine interest, something different, something she actually wanted all along, just in a form that did not require her to be smaller than she is. Meanwhile, Ted is conducting his own investigation within the school, and his arc within the Acorn Center runs parallel to Tim's, but in a different key, where Tim's undercover work keeps pulling him back into relationship and emotional presence, keeps insisting that the mission and the personal are not separable. Ted approaches the investigation with the professionalism of someone who has learned to keep the personal and the operational in separate compartments. This is, of course, exactly what the film has already established as Ted's primary defense mechanism, the substitution of competence for connection, of operational effectiveness for genuine vulnerability. And the film is doing something clever here. It is putting Ted in a situation where his professionalism is genuinely useful, genuinely valuable to the mission, and simultaneously showing you how the same quality that makes him effective is the quality that has cost him his intimacy with his brother, and we begin to understand with his own daughter as well. Because here is information the film reveals gradually, and then all at once. Ted has a daughter. Ted has a daughter who is not a baby, who is older, who is at a stage of her own development that Ted has been professionally too busy to fully inhabit with her. The film does not dwell on this. It gives it to you in pieces, in the spaces between Ted's operational efficiency, in the moments when the Ted as child registers something about Tabitha's situation that is slightly too specific, slightly too personal for someone who is simply executing a mission. Ted recognizes in Tabitha in her particular brand of managed loneliness, in the way she has learned to perform capability as a substitute for connection, something that he knows from his own relationship with his own child, something he has created in his own home without meaning to. And the film does not have Ted articulate this explicitly. It trusts the performance, trusts the audience, trusts that you will see what Ted is seeing and understand why it hits him the way it does. Now let us talk about Dr. Armstrong's reveal, because it is the film's most significant plot event and the moment where all the thematic threads the film has been weaving are suddenly pulled taut and held together. Armstrong is revealed to be the original boss baby, not Ted, not anyone from the contemporary baby cop infrastructure, but a baby from a much earlier era of the operation, a baby who was sent into the world decades ago and who, unlike Ted, never outgrew the mission, who never outgrew the specific conviction that the world of childhood was worth protecting and that the world of adulthood was worth resisting, who had spent decades building an institution designed not to cultivate exceptional children but to arrest their development, to keep them perpetually in a state of exceptional childhood rather than allowing them to grow into the full and complicated persons that exceptional children become. Jeff Goldblum's performance in the Armstrong reveal is, I want to argue, one of the most interesting villain performances in recent animated cinema precisely because of what it chooses not to do. It does not dip into conventional villainy. It does not shift into the register of menace or contempt or the cold cruelty that we associate with animated antagonists. What Goldblum's Armstrong does in his reveal is something more disturbing. He remains utterly sincere. He explains his mission with the calm, clear-eyed conviction of someone who believes, genuinely, without irony, without self-awareness of the damage he is doing, that what he is offering these children is a gift. He is not lying to himself. He is not concealing his true feelings behind a performed ideology. He truly believes that what he is doing is right, and the performance captures that sincerity in a way that makes him far more unsettling than a conventionally deceitful villain would be. Think about what that means for the film's thematic argument. If Armstrong were simply lying, if his stated belief in the value of permanent childhood were a cover for ordinary selfishness or greed or power seeking, then defeating him would be uncomplicated. You would simply expose the lie, reveal the true motivation, and the ideology would collapse. But Armstrong is not lying. His belief is real, and that means that defeating him is more complicated. It requires actually engaging with what he believes, actually making a case for the value of growing up, actually arguing that the loss of childhood, for all its genuine cost, is not a catastrophe but a passage, and that what adulthood offers, if you carry your childhood with you rather than leaving it behind, is something worth having. The film does not make this argument explicitly, but it makes it structurally through what the mentor discover about themselves and each other in their time as children, through what they choose when the mission reaches its crisis point, through what they are willing to give up and what they insist on keeping. Armstrong School has been secretly administering a modified version of the age regression formula to its students, not to restore childhood but to sustain it, to prevent the natural cognitive and emotional development that would eventually carry these children beyond their childhood gifts into the more complex and less legible landscape of adolescence and adulthood. He has been, in the most literal possible sense, stopping time. Stopping the very process that the rest of the film has been insisting is not the enemy but the teacher, not the loss but the condition of deeper gain. His institution is the physical embodiment of the ideology that the film has been quietly arguing against from its first frame. The ideology that says the past is better than the present, that what we were is preferable to what we become, that love means keeping things the same rather than accompanying each other through change. The film's climax structurally requires Tim and Ted to work together in the fullest sense, not just operationally, not just in the mode of two competent individuals executing a shared mission, but genuinely together, genuinely present to each other, genuinely relying on the other in ways that neither professionalism nor managed warmth can provide. And the film constructs the climax in a way that makes this requirement not a plot convenience but an emotional necessity, makes it impossible for them to succeed without first being honest with each other, without first addressing what has been unaddressed between them, without first acknowledging the distance that has grown and choosing, actively and deliberately, to close it. There is a specific exchange in the film's climactic sequence that I want to isolate and examine carefully because it is the purest expression of the film's emotional core. Tim and Ted are in physical danger, and the situation requires one of them to make a sacrifice, first one of them to do something that will cost them, and the cost is not trivial. It is the cost of the mission's success in exchange for something personal. And in the pressure of that moment, in the specific intimacy that crisis forces on people, Ted says something to Tim that is simultaneously a practical instruction and the most genuine thing he has said in the entire film. He does not frame it as an emotional declaration. He does not preface it with acknowledgement of the distance between them or the years of maintained rather than felt relationship. He simply says the true thing, the thing that admits need, the thing that admits that he cannot do this alone and has not been able to do most things alone, even when he has been pretending otherwise. And the film does not underscore it. It does not have Tim respond with a mirror declaration. It has Tim simply act on it, which is a more honest rendering of how genuine communication between brothers actually works. It does not require a full verbal acknowledgement to be received and understood. This instance is where the film earns its emotional climax, not in the action resolution, the defeat of Armstrong and the reversal of what he has done to the Acorn Center's children, but in this small unhurried moment of one brother admitting to another that he has been performing self-sufficiency rather than practicing it, that the confidence is real but the completeness is not, that there is something he needs that only this specific person can provide. It is a brief moment. It is easy to miss, but it is the moment that everything else in the film has been building toward, and the film is right to deliver it quietly rather than dramatically, because the quieter the delivery, the more it sounds like real life. The resolution of Armstrong as a villain is worth examining carefully because it reveals something about the film's intellectual honesty. Armstrong is not killed. He is not imprisoned in any traditional narrative sense. He is instead de-aged by his own formula. He is made into a baby again, which within the film's mythology is a form of return rather than a punishment, a return to a state of potential that has not yet been foreclosed by the specific path that the adult Armstrong took. There is something both comic and genuinely thought-provoking about this resolution. The film is not saying that Armstrong was right. It is not endorsing his ideology by returning him to the child that he spent his life trying to protect. What it is saying is more interesting than that. It is saying that the origin of his ideology was somewhere real and somewhere painful, that the child who eventually became Armstrong was a child who lost something in growing up that hurt in a way that never fully healed, and that the compassionate response to that hurt is not to validate ideology it produced, but to go back before the ideology formed, back to the wound, and see if something different is possible this time. This is, I want to suggest, a remarkable thing for a family animation sequel to do with its villain. Most animated villains are resolved either through defeat or death or humiliation, through the erasure or the diminishment of the threatening force. Armstrong is resolved to something closer to redemption, but a redemption that the film is honest enough not to perform the full arc of within its runtime. He becomes a baby again. What happens next? What choices that baby will eventually make? What path this particular consciousness will take when offered the opportunity to do childhood differently? The film does not tell you. It leaves it genuinely open. And in that openness, there is a kind of respect for the complexity of the character that is unusual and impressive. A refusal to tie everything neatly into the satisfying bow that franchise animation tends to demand. Now let us talk about Tabitha and Tim, and the specific scene between them that I consider the film's most emotionally generous moment and the one that has stayed with me most completely. It occurs after the crisis, after the mission has been resolved and the immediate danger has passed, and it is a scene that the film has no plot reason to include. The story is over, the villain is defeated, the danger is past, but which the film includes anyway because the story that matters, the story beneath the adventure story, has not yet been resolved. Tim and Tabitha need to find each other, not find each other in the physical sense. They are in the same room, but find each other in the sense that matters, the sense that the film has been building toward from its first sequence. The scene is constructed around a reversal that is elegant in its simplicity. Tim, who has been undercover as a child and who has therefore been relating to Tabitha without the weight of fatherhood, without the specific quality of parental love that looks backward at who you were and forward at who I want you to be, rather than simply being present to who you are right now, finally reveals himself to her. And in the moment of revelation, in the moment when Tabitha understands that this child she has begun to trust is actually her father, the film allows both of them to hold the complexity of that discovery without resolving it prematurely. Tabitha's response is not immediately warm, it is complicated. There is something like betrayal in it. She has shared things with this child that she has not shared with her father, and discovering that they are the same person means that her father now knows things about her that she did not choose to tell him as her father, and the question of whether that knowing is a gift or a violation of her carefully maintained privacy is not simple. But then, and this is where the film shows its real emotional intelligence, Tabitha asks Tim a question. Not a confrontational question, not a question designed to establish fault or assign responsibility. A genuine question. She asks him if what she told the child is also true for the father, if the things she admitted, the loneliness and the performance and the specific cost of being exceptional in environments that recognize capability without seeing personhood, if all of that is something the father already knew or something the father needed to hear. And Tim, who has spent the entire film trying to connect with a daughter, who has been deflecting his attempts with the gentle efficiency of a child who has stopped expecting to be truly met, answers her honestly. He tells her that he did not know. He tells her that he wanted to know, that he had been trying to know, and that she had not let him, and that he had not found the right form for asking. He does not blame her. He does not excuse himself. He simply names what happened. The mutual failure of two people who love each other deeply and have been loving each other through the wrong interface, and Tabitha listens, and something changes. Not dramatically, not in the way that cinematic relations tend to unfold with swelling music and embraces and explicit verbal declarations of renewed commitment. It changes in the quieter way that real things change, in a shift of posture, in the quality of eye contact, in the very slight relaxation of the careful composure that Tabitha has been maintaining. She has been seen, not recognized, seen. The difference that the film has been drawing attention to for its entire runtime has finally been lived rather than described. And because the film has been so patient in establishing the distinction, the moment of genuine seeing, when it arrives, carries the accumulated weight of everything that preceded it. It does not need to be large, its size is in its accumulation. Let us now turn to what happens between Tim and Ted in the film's final movement, because this is the resolution that the film's entire architecture has been building toward, and I want to walk through it carefully and honestly and with the attention it deserves. After the mission is complete, after Armstrong has been neutralized and the children of the Acorn Center have been freed from the effects of the age suppression, Tim and Ted face the moment that has been implicit from the film's first scene, the moment when the de-aging formula will wear off, when they will return to their adult bodies and their adult lives, and the question becomes what they will carry back with them from the experience of having been children together again. The film handles this moment with a structure and sophistication that I want to name explicitly, because it is not handled the way you might expect. You might expect a scene of explicit verbal reconciliation, a scene where Tim and Ted name the distance between them, acknowledge what has been lost, and commit to doing better. This is how these scenes are usually written. They are written as conversational resolutions, as scenes where feelings are named and the naming resolves them. Family Business does something different, and something I think more true. It gives Tim and Ted a scene that is largely wordless, or nearly so. A scene that lives in what they do rather than what they say, in the choices they make rather than the feelings they articulate. What they do is play. Specifically, they play one of the games from their shared childhood, one of the private rituals that belongs only to their specific relationship, one of the coded languages that brothers develop between themselves that no one else would understand, and that would sound like nothing to anyone listening from the outside. And the film lets them play it. It does not use the playing as setup for a conversation. It does not interrupt it with a revelation or a crisis. It just lets two men who are also briefly the children they were, play together in the way that children play, which is to say with complete presence, with no concern for how it looks from the outside, with nothing at stake except the pleasure of being in the same space as someone you love doing something that belongs to both of you. And watching this, you understand what the film has been building toward, not a declaration, not an acknowledgement, not even a promise of future closeness, though the implication of such a promise is present. What the film has been building toward is this: the experience of being fully present with each other for the first time in years, in the specific form of presence that childhood play provides, which is the form most resistant to the defensive management that adult intimacy tends to accumulate. The reconciliation does not happen in words, it happens in the playing. It happens in the decision of two men to be ridiculous together, to be unself-conscious together, to be the versions of themselves that existed before self-consciousness became part of the bargain of togetherness. This is the film's central gift to its audience, and it is delivered not as a lesson but as an experience. You do not learn from this scene, you feel it, and feeling it is the point. When the formula finally wears off, when Tim and Ted return to their adult forms in the ordinary world, in the ordinary present tense of their ordinary lives, something has changed in them that the film renders without announcement. They look at each other differently. Not with the warm, comfortably, slightly distant warmth of the film's opening, not with the managed warmth of a maintained relationship, but with a specific quality of attention that comes from having recently and vividly been reminded that the person in front of you is not only the person you have built a comfortable relationship with, but also the person who knew you before either of you knew yourselves, and that this earlier knowledge is still available, still capable of informing and enriching the present tense relationship if both of you feel there. The film does not show you what their relationship looks like after this. It does not give you a scene of Tim and Ted successfully inhabiting a closer and more genuine closeness in their adult lives, of the practical changes they make to spend more time together, to have real conversations rather than comfortable ones, to maintain the relationship with active intention rather than letting it maintain itself. It does not give you this because giving you this would be false. Real change does not resolve itself in a single experience, however powerful. Real change is the beginning of a direction rather than the arrival at a destination. What the film gives you instead is the moment before the direction begins. The moment where the direction has been chosen but the walking has not yet started, and it trusts you to carry the implication of that choice forward yourself. This trust in the audience to complete the emotional arc is, I think, the film's most mature creative choice, and it is a choice that requires real confidence from everyone who made this film. It would have been easier, commercially safer, narratively more satisfying in the short term to show you the happy ending, to show you Tim and Ted scheduling regular calls and actually talking on them, to show you the relationship repaired and flourishing in the new form that the experience of the film has made possible. But the film understands something that most franchise animation does not, that the resolution of an emotional arc does not require demonstration, it requires belief. If you have followed Tim and Ted through the film's full emotional journey, if you have been present for the playing the final movement, if you felt the quality of their looking at each other in the film's closing moments, then you already know what happens next. You do not need to be shown it, you have already felt it, which is more real than seeing it. There are two more things I want to examine in the film's final stretch, and both of them are easy to overlook because they exist at the edges of the narrative rather than at its center. The first is Tina. In the film's denouement, Tina, who has been, for most of the climax, used primarily as a tactical resource rather than as a fully active character, has a moment of genuine personhood that the film delivers almost as an aside, as a small grace note rather than a major chord, but that I find quietly beautiful and worth attending to. It is a moment where Tina, who has spent the entire film operating in the professional register of the boss baby identity, executing the mission, managing the assets, maintaining the competence, reaches for her father's hand, not as a mission requirement, not as part of a tactical calculation, just as a baby, just as a small person who wants to be held, and Tim, who does not yet know what Tina is, and who in this moment simply knows her as his daughter, reaches back. This moment is 10 seconds long, maybe 12. The film does not linger on it. It does not give it a musical swell or a slow motion treatment. It just lets it happen and moves on. But it is doing something that the whole film has been setting up and that the whole film needed. It is showing you that the professional and the personal are not in opposition, that the baby who runs a corporation and the baby who wants to be held by her father are the same baby, that the exceptionalism and the ordinary human need for love are not competing identities but aspects of the same complex person. Tina will grow up. She will probably, given who she is and what she is capable of, grow up to be exceptional. And the film is saying that what will determine the texture of her exceptionalism, whether it will be Armstrong's kind, brittle and defended, and ultimately self-defeating, or the kind that is rooted in real relationship and real belonging, is this moments this hand, this being heard. The film is small and specific in how it delivers this, and the smallness is the point. The second thing I want to examine is the post film implication of what Tim has discovered about Tabitha and what he intends to do with that discovery. The film's final movement for Tim and Tabitha is not their scene within the Acorn Center. It is a quieter moment, a domestic moment, a moment that occurs in ordinary space after the extraordinary space of the mission has been left behind. Tim comes home, Tabitha is there, and Tim sits with her in the way that the child who was Tim sat with the child who is Tabitha, with genuine interest, without agenda, without the forward looking quality of parental love that is always partly about the future version of the person rather than the present one. He asks her a real question, not a check in question, not a parental maintenance question, but a question that could only come from someone who has been paying attention and who has seen something specific and who is genuinely curious about what it is. And Tabitha answers him. Not at length, not with the full opening that conversation within the school represented, but with a degree of genuine response that is more than she has offered him in any of the film's earlier domestic scenes. It is a beginning. It is the very beginning of a different kind of knowing. And the film closes on this beginning rather than on its completion, which is honest and which is right. The very last image of the film, the final frame before the credits begin, returns to the house. The house from the opening image. The house of childhood, the shared origin, the common ground that Tim and Ted were both built on. And the house in this final image is the same house it was in the opening image, same palette, same warmth, same gentle softness at the edges that distinguishes memory from the present tense. But the quality of looking has changed. The film is looking at the house now with the full accumulated knowledge of everything that has happened, and the house carries more weight in this final frame than it did in the first one, precisely because of everything that has been experienced between those two images. It is the same house. It means more now. And the decision to close with this image is the decision to say, we started here and we are not ending somewhere different. We are ending here more fully. We are ending here with more understanding of what here actually is. The past is not behind us. It is underneath us. We carry it with us whether or not we know it. And the only question is whether we carry it as a weight or as a foundation. That is the film's last word. Not spoken, shown, and cinema at its best always says its last word in this way, in an image that does not explain itself, that trusts you to feel its weight without being told what it means, that offers you the experience of a truth rather than the statement of it, and then lets you go back into your own life carrying something that was not there before you sat down. There is a particular kind of silence that settles over you after certain films, and not the silence of emptiness, not the silence of having been given nothing to carry home. The other kind, the silence of fullness, the silence that comes when something has been given to you and you have not yet found the language for it, when the experience is still too fresh and too present to be organized into thought, when it lives in you as a feeling rather than a framework, and you are not yet ready to convert it into something more manageable. That is the silence that the boss baby family business left behind in me. And I want to sit in that silence for a moment before I try to speak from it, because what I have to say from within it is more honest than what I could say from a more composed distance. I did not expect to be moved by this film the way I was moved by it. I want to be honest about that. I came to it as a reviewer, which is to say, I came to it with a portion of my attention always slightly outside the experience, always partly observing the experience rather than simply having it, always noting and cataloguing and preparing to describe. That is the occupation I led of thinking seriously about films. The thinking can get between you and the feeling, and sometimes the most important films are the ones that find a way past the thinking anyway, that bypass the analytical apparatus and reach something in you that does not know how to defend itself against sincerity. This film did that to me. It found its way past the thinking, and what it found when it got there surprised me. What it found was something I had not fully acknowledged, a specific and personal resonance with the film's central subject, that made watching it a more complicated experience than simply evaluating it. I have a sibling. I suspect you do too. Or you have had someone in your life who functioned with the specific intimacy of a sibling, who knew you before you became who you are, who carries a version of you that the present tense you has somewhat departed from, who loves you in the particular and irreplaceable way that only someone who has known you across time can love you. And I have, like Timothy, experienced a specific and quietly devastating drift that the film is about. The drift that happens not because anything goes wrong, but because everything goes right, because life continues and fills up, and the relationship that should have been maintained actively gets maintained passively instead, through the mechanics of occasion and calendar, and the comfortable loafer dynamic that works well enough that neither party feels urgent about. Deep in it, watching Tim and Ted navigate this drift, watching the film put language and image around an experience that I had felt but not fully examined, was the experience of being understood by something that was not made for me and did not know I was watching. That is the specific miracle of good art, not that it speaks to everyone in the same way, but that it speaks to each person in the specific way that their particular experience of the universal truth requires. The film's understanding of sibling drift is general enough to be universal and specific enough to feel personal, and the combination of those two qualities is the thing that leaves a mark. The single moment that has not left me, and here I want to be as precise as I can, because imprecision would betray the moment, is not the playing scene, though the playing scene is close. It is not the final image of the house, though the final image of the house is close. It is a smaller moment than either of those, a moment so brief that I almost missed it on first viewing and only caught it because something in my body registered it before my conscious attention did. It is the moment when Ted, in his child body, looks at his brother, looks at him, who is also a child, who is also undefended, who is also carrying the full weight of their shared history in a body that has not yet learned to carry weight with composure, and simply smiles. Not a plot relevant smile, not a smile that is doing anything in the narrative, just a smile, the smile of someone who, in a moment of grace, is genuinely glad to be exactly where they are with exactly the person they are with. A smile that belongs to the foundation rather than the building. A smile that says, I remember this, I remember us, I am glad we are here. That smile has not left me. I think about it when I think about my own people, my own siblings, my own long relationships, the people I love in the full and complicated and time-bound way that only a shared history makes possible. I think about what it would cost to return to the version of those relationships that existed before the armor and the busyness and the comfortable distance, and whether that return is possible without a magical formula. And the answer the film gives, the answer that I keep returning to, is that it is possible. It is possible without magic. It requires only the willingness to be ridiculous together again, to be small again, to care less about being impressive than about being present. It requires only the willingness to choose each other actively rather than maintaining each other passively. That is all. That is everything. That is the simplest and hardest thing. Did this film change how I see something? I think it sharpened something rather than changed it. It sharpened my awareness of the specific texture of the relationships in my own life that have settled into maintenance rather than growth, that I navigate with practiced warmth rather than genuine curiosity, that I could deepen if I were willing to be less comfortable in them. The film did not tell me this. I already knew it, the way you know things that you have not yet decided to act on. What the film did was make the knowing more vivid, more present, less possible to set aside. It made the thing I already knew feel urgent rather than theoretical, and that urgency, the urgency of all that takes something you've been comfortably aware of and makes it impossible to remain comfortable about, is the most valuable thing a piece of art can do to you. Would I return to this film? I already have. I have watched it twice in the process of writing this essay, and each viewing has given me something different. The first viewing gave me the emotional experience, the full encounter with the feeling, the smile that stayed with me. The second viewing gave me the architecture, the deliberate construction beneath the feeling, the specific choices that produced the effects I had felt without analyzing. And I know that a third viewing will give me something else again, something that neither of the first two viewings made available, because what films offer you in subsequent viewings is always shaped by what you are carrying when you return to them, and what I will be carrying next time will include the experience of having written about the film at length, of having turned it over and examined it from multiple angles, and that examination will have changed what I am capable of seeing in it. Good films reward return. They are patient with you. They do not give you everything at once. They wait for you to be ready for the next thing they have to offer. What kind of person will carry this film with them? I have thought about this carefully, and I want to answer it honestly rather than broadly. The person who will carry this film is not necessarily the person who watches the most films or thinks about cinema most analytically. The person who will carry this film is the person who, as a sibling, they have drifted from, the person who, as a parent, they stopped truly talking to somewhere between then and now. The person who has a childhood friend who used to know them completely and who now knows them only in the managed, surface presenting way of an adult relationship. The person who has felt the specific and quiet grief of loving someone and no longer quite reaching them, of being in the same room as someone and sensing the distance across it. This film belongs to those people in a way that it does not quite belong to everyone, and the people it belongs to will know it immediately and will carry it for a long time. But I also want to say something about the children who will carry this film. The children who watch it without the adult framework I have been bringing to it, without the specific kind of loss that makes its emotional subject matter personal in the way I have described. The children who watch this film are watching a story about two brothers who find their way back to each other. And in that story, they are receiving something about what relationship is for and what relationship requires that will live in them as a felt truth rather than an understood one, that will be available to them later when they have the experiences that make it comprehensible as more than a story. The film is planting something in these children. It is planting the knowledge, not yet fully understood, but felt, that the people you love require your attention, require your active choosing, require something more than the comfortable assumption that they will always be there in the same form that you remember them in. This is a seed that will take years to germinate, but the film plants it with care and with confidence, and the fact that the children watching it cannot yet articulate what has been planted in them does not diminish the planting. It may be the most important thing the film does. Now let me speak to you directly as a person who has spent a great deal of time with this film and who has tried to be as honest with you as the film was with me. The Boss Baby Family Business is a film that I would recommend without reservation to nearly every kind of viewer, with different expectations for what each kind of viewer will find in it, and with honest acknowledgement of where it falls short of its own best aspirations. Let me be specific. If you are someone who loves animation as an art form, who brings to animated cinema the same quality of attention you bring to the films you consider most serious and most important, this film will reward you. Not perfectly. There are moments where the franchise machinery is more visible than the artist's hand. Moments where the adventure plot runs longer than the emotional story requires. Moments where a character the film has invested in is used for convenience rather than given the space their complexity deserves. These are real limitations and I will not minimize them, but they are the limitations of a film that is reaching for more than it is guaranteed to achieve, and the reaching matters. A film that tries something difficult and achieves it imperfectly is worth more of your time than a film that attempts nothing and succeeds completely at nothing. If you are a parent, if you have children, and particularly if you have children who are at any stage of the long, complex, gradually autonomizing arc of growing up, this film will speak to you in the specific way that films about parenting speak to parents, which is to say that it will speak past your defenses. It will find the part of you that wants to hold on and the part of you that knows holding on is not love, and it will hold both of those parts with equal honesty and equal compassion. You recognize yourself in Tim. You may recognize your own child in Tabitha, and if you watch this film with your child in the room, you may find that something passes between you in the watching of it that neither of you will be able to fully describe, but that both of you will feel If you have a sibling, if you have a sibling you are close to, or a sibling you have drifted from, or a sibling you love in the maintained rather than the felt way that the film understands so precisely, watch this film with the specific quality of attention you bring to things that are about you. Because this film is about you. It knows your relationship in ways that should be impossible for a piece of entertainment produced by a large animation studio about a fictional baby executive. The fact that it knows your relationship anyway is what makes it more than entertainment. The fact that it knows your relationship anyway is what makes it art. How should you experience this film? Cinema, if you have the opportunity, if you can find it on a screen larger than the one in your living room, in a darkened space with other people, with the surrender that only the cinema architecture demands. The film was built for this experience. Its visual language, its sound design, its use of color and space as carriers of meaning, all of this operates most fully when received at the scale and in the conditions it was designed for. If cinema is not available, watch it on the largest screen you have access to, in the darkest room you can arrange, with the volume high enough to let the sound design do what it was built to do. Do not watch it on your phone. Do not watch it as something in the background of another activity. Give it your full attention. It has earned your full attention and it will repay that attention in kind. Is this a film to own? Yes, unhesitatingly. This is a film that gives you something different each time you return to it, that has layers of craft and care embedded in its texture, that reveal themselves gradually across multiple viewings, that will mean different things to you at different points in your life, as your experience of the subjects it engages with deepens and changes. Things that reward return are worth owning. Films that have something new to show you every time you come back are worth keeping close. My rating for The Boss Baby Family Business is 8 out of 10, and I want to earn that rating with a single true sentence, because a number without a sentence is an opinion, and an opinion without a reason is just noise. 8 is the sentence. This film understands that love is not a feeling but a practice, and it delivers that understanding not as a lesson but as a lived experience. And there are very few films of any kind, animated or live action, for children or for adults, with large budgets or small ones, that can truthfully claim to have done the same thing with the same care and the same honesty. 8 out of 10 is not perfect, but 8 out of 10 is a film that moved me, that stayed with me, that changed the quality of my attention to my own relationships even briefly, and that asked questions I found myself still turning over long after the credits had finished. That is enough. That is more than enough. That is, in fact, the reason I love cinema. The last shot of a great film is always a gift, not a conclusion. A gift. It gives you something to carry into the ordinary world, something that changes the color of the ordinary, something that makes the drive home or the walk down the street or the conversation over dinner slightly different from what it would have been without the film. The last image of the boss baby, family business, that house, that warm palette, that foundation is a gift of exactly this kind. It sends you back into your own life with the question of your own foundations fresh in your awareness, with the question of who knew you before you became who you are, and whether you are still in genuine contact with that knowing. It sends you back asking, and films that send you back asking something real are the films that matter. They are the films that justify the darkness and the silence and the shared surrender of the cinema. They are the reason we keep going back. Now, before I let you go, and I am genuinely grateful for the time you have spent here, for the quality of attention you have brought to this essay, for choosing to feel a film rather than simply to watch one. I want to spend a few moments with you in the ordinary warmth of this space we share, because the Cine Flux is not just a place where films are analyzed. It is a place where films are felt, and the feeling requires company, and I am grateful for yours. If this essay gave you something, if it offered you a perspective you had not considered, or sharpened a feeling you had already had, or sent you back to the film with new eyes, or persuaded you to seek it out for the first time, I would love to know. Not in the abstract way of a platform asking for engagement, but genuinely. The comment section beneath this essay is one of my favorite places on the internet because of what you bring to it, the specific observations, the personal connections, the moments where someone shares what a film meant to them in a way that opens the film up further rather than closing it down. So I want to leave you with a few genuine questions. Questions I am actually curious about, questions that I hope will start a conversation worth having. Here is the first. The film centers on a relationship between brothers, and I have spoken about it largely through that specific lens. But the film also speaks to any relationship that has drifted, any close relationship that has been maintained rather than grown. I want to know which relationship in your own life this film spoke to most directly, and what you did or thought about doing in the days after watching it. Here is the second. Armstrong's belief, the belief that adulthood is a form of loss and that childhood is worth protecting, is a belief the film treats as villainous in its extreme form, but that contains something recognizable and sympathetic at its core. I want to know where you land on this. Is growing up always worth what it costs? Is there something we surrender in adulthood that the best version of adult life should find a way to recover? I do not have a clean answer to this, and I am curious about yours. And here is the third. I spoke at length about what animated cinema can do at its best, about the tradition of animated filmmaking that treats the form as a vehicle for universal human truth rather than as a medium for children's entertainment. I want to know which animated film has moved you most, not which is your favorite, not which you find most technically impressive, but which one left the specific mark of genuine feeling, the mark that only the best art leaves, the mark that stays. As for what is coming next on the Cine Flux, I am not quite ready to tell you everything, but I will tell you this: we are going somewhere that is the opposite of this film in almost every surface quality, in tone, in visual language, in genre, in the kind of darkness it is willing to inhabit, and yet which asks, underneath its very different surface, almost exactly the same question that Family Business asks. The question of what we owe to the people who were there at the beginning. The question of what it costs to remain known and what it costs to stop being known, and whether the cost of either is something we can honestly evaluate from inside the life that is being it. I cannot wait to sit with you in that film. I cannot wait to feel it together. If this essay has meant something to you, share it with someone it will mean something to. Not because this channel needs the numbers, though it does. And I am grateful for every subscriber and every like and every decision to ring that notification bell, but because the films we share with people become shared property, become part of the language of the relationship, become one of the ways we know each other and are known. Sharing a film essay with someone is a small act of saying, I think this thing about this film matters, and I think you are someone for whom it will matter too. That is not a small thing. That is, in fact, exactly what Tim and Ted needed to do for each other all along. Thank you. Sincerely, fully, without any professional distance. Thank you for being here. Thank you for feeling cinema. Thank you for being the kind of person who wants to understand what a film means rather than just what it shows. The world is better for your attention, and this channel exists because of it. That is the Cine Flux. I will see you in the next one.